Well, good evening, and we are just a little bit away from getting started. And I didn't think about putting a notice out beforehand, so there is a likelihood that people may have forgotten that we took last week off as far as our talks on humility and leadership, the Cruciform Way, and I had a great vacation. Received a wonderful email from Ken and Karen Gasper, and glad you're joining with us from Bellingham, and thank you for the email. I just stepped back today as far as vacation, and I will get back to you guys. I again want to encourage people who are participating that the feedback is really helpful, and it's been encouraging to hear from many of you as far as just your experience of these talks and the encouragement that I've received, as well as some of the ideas. So please keep it going. If you're not watching live, again, I want to encourage you to go ahead and leave comments. You can do that on Facebook. You can also email me just at the church, rkinnicker@westside1.org. And I'll get those emails, and I find it all very helpful. We are in a place where we are doing, we're in the section of my dissertation, which is the literature review. And the opportunity that I had in doing all of this work was reading well over 100 different books on the topics of humility and leadership, and diving into this topic so that I can kind of wrap my arms around some of the material, and really, for me, it became this part of really realizing that I think that there is a lot to be learned, and there's a lot to retrieve from the New Testament idea of humility and how humility and leadership go together. And in the midst of this review, we started with the questions about what is leadership. And, we started with the question, do humility and leadership go together? And then, and we said not everybody sees it. But there's a building consensus that there is this movement towards really seeing that humility and leadership go together. Ken and Karen Gasper watched a leadership summit, and there were a couple of speakers, or a few speakers, who actually spoke into the significance of this leadership and humility. And that was proof as well as encouragement of going, yeah, more and more people are seeing this. And then we looked at the fact that a big part of this issue is how people understand leadership. And leadership has become this broad, expansive topic. There's all different ways that we can do it. Most likely, if you are focusing on leadership where you're looking at the individual leader, and then you're looking at really the task of leading and the person who is leading over the situation in which they're leading the organization, you will probably end up having the greatest likelihood that humility will finally be recognized as something as important. As important as it is of understanding kind of the definitions of leadership, at the same time, the definitions of humility are even more important. And so this is now where we're diving into the literature that's specifically on humility. And we started first with just historical background, and there's not too much as far as books that you could go to that would give you a history of the virtue of humility. I recommended one in particular by Dixon, and very good, Humilitas. And then we shifted to the Christian tradition, and this was one of my working assumptions going in, is that while I don't think there would be any silver bullet that would just easily be something that would help humility be formed in us, I had great confidence that through the work of Christ, the Holy Spirit, as well as the Christian tradition, that we would find all the resources that we need to really help us cultivate humility. And that's where we began to then lean into the Christian tradition. Now, we have 2,000 years of Christian tradition. And so what I ended up doing was narrowing my focus on some of the high points. And in particular, I looked at Augustine, and we discussed Augustine a little bit last week, because Augustine became one of these people who tried to intentionally have dialogue with the philosophical Greek tradition, and then to affirm some of the truth that is found within Greek philosophy, but baptize it within Christian thought. And in particular, it was towards the cultivation of Christian virtue. And we're probably most familiar with the 7 deadly sins. And with the 7 deadly sins, there is the counter. Each one of those 7 deadly sins is countered by a Christian virtue. There's 7 because there's 7 cardinal virtues. Faith, hope, and love are the most important virtues according to Augustine's schema. And then the 4 others are 4 typical ones of Greco-Roman moralists. The first 3, faith, hope, and love, are what he would call theological virtues. They are graces. We would not come to it apart from biblical revelation. Humility was not part of his 7 cardinal virtues. But interestingly, humility is central to Augustine's own thoughts about what distinguishes Christianity from paganism. The other part that Augustine really contributed into our understanding of humility was that humility is a work of grace. This way of being does not come to us all on our own. This is something that God's going to do. And then there became this tension, because a virtue is something that you can cultivate, but a grace is something that requires God. And this is the part where, in the Christian tradition, there is this tension and this synthesis between what God does and what we do. And different times and different places through Christian history, that synthesis will get worked out a little bit differently. We, in the Protestant tradition, we go back to Scripture. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work within you to will and to do his good will. And so we live into that tension. It's grace, but grace is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to an attitude of earning. That comes from Dallas Willard, who is, I think, one of our more significant spiritual writers of the last 50 years. And I think that's a key idea there, is to say, okay, grace is not opposed to our effort. The Holy Spirit is like a personal trainer who wants us to work out our salvation with him. And this would include then the pursuit of Christian virtues, the pursuit of holy habits. Something that has been, through much of the Protestant tradition, minimalized, because out of Luther's experience, he was very much afraid of works and a works mentality, which would be that earning mentality. Grace is opposed to an attitude of earning, but it is not opposed to effort. And Luther himself would affirm that reality. We finished with Augustine, and now we are moving into Benedict of Nursia. And we're going to focus on 2 people in the monastic tradition, Benedict and Bernard of Clairvaux. Benedict, one of the more significant, if not the most significant writer to impact monasticism outside of the scriptures. The rule book of Saint Benedict has had a long and significant impact on the entire movement of monasticism, and central to his focus and central to his work on the rule of Saint Benedict is the pursuit of humility. Because what we find in monasticism, which I argued 2 weeks ago when we last met, was if you were looking for that part of the church that was most intentional about passionately seeking the way of Jesus Christ, for much of church history, it would have been among the monastics. It would have been among those who took monastic orders. They weren't as concerned with worldly things and politics and power and a lot of the organization of the church. They were really pursuing God. And central to that pursuit of how to develop this relationship with God, how to be conformed to the likeness of Christ, at the center of it for the monks was humility. And this is part of our story of humility is that back in the Greco-Roman world, what the New Testament called humility, tapeinos and tapaphrosune, was despised and was seen as an anti-virtue. With the coming of Christ, he radically redefines glory at the center of the contest between Greco-Roman civilization and understanding and the way of Christianity was this contest between humility and glory, and how do you actually pursue this? And the Christian idea of humility ultimately was central to the transformation of the Greco-Roman world, because glory got redefined according to the ways of Jesus, not according to the ways that the Greco-Romans had done it previously. And so part of the story is something that is despised, that becomes esteemed, that becomes central to the pursuit of Christ's likeness and living out a godly life for more than 1,000 years. And then humility started to see a decline, and we'll talk about that when we get into the philosophical tradition. But Benedict of Nursia, some of you may not have really any familiarity, and I'll give you a little bit of the story, but I'm focusing on the rule book in particular. So Benedict started out, and there's two major branches of monasticism. There is what you would call the Hermetic branch, and then the Cenobitic. And the idea here is it's either the lone hermit, the individual, who goes off into the wilderness by himself, and that's the earliest form of monasticism tended in that direction. It was that in the beginning. And then there was a move away from just these individuals to then a commune, a community, a group that chose to live together and entered into a type of a covenant together of saying we are going to pursue Christ together. And that became, in its different expressions, Cenobitic monasticism, communal monasticism. And Benedict of Nursia, while he was not the first, ended up creating a rule book that he, as an abbot, that he wrote, that ended up not only creating Benedictine monks who followed that, but basically every other school of monasticism in some way then became a reflection, or at least was in dialogue with an understanding of where Benedict was coming from. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, humility is a ladder. The ladder of humility is among the most abiding and influential constructs that accompany the spread of the rule of Saint Benedict. Part of the reason that it was so popular is because he helped people understand how to pursue humility, because it was at the center of why people became monks, because it was at the center of their understanding of what it meant to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. The discussion of the ladder of humility is found in the 7th chapter of the rule book. It is the longest chapter, and I ended last week with this. For someone like Paul Delot, who is a Benedictine specialist, he says, it is justly regarded, this 7th chapter, this ladder of humility discussion, as the finished expression of monastic spirituality. And what Paul Delot is trying to say in that is that if you want to go and understand what the monastic movement was all about forming this relationship with Christ, all you got to do is read the 7th chapter, and it's right there. This is what it's about. Benedict's opening words to the chapter offer both the goal and description of the ladder of humility. I read this last time as we ended, and I'll read it again today. And part of this is that these works come to us in translation. We get a good translation. It's readable, and we can still find value in going back and reading these primary sources. It can take a little bit of work, but I was having a conversation a few weeks ago with Sean Bassler about just kind of the first time cutting my teeth into Augustine and really beginning to read some of the things that he wrote 1,600 years ago, and realizing just the genius that he was, and the insights that he had, and there is a there's a value of spending a life where there is this focus on how to develop relationship with God, how to develop relationship with people, and there's some things in our society today where we tend to know a lot, but we get spread really thin. They may not have had as wide a corpus of information about things as we did, but they tended to dive fairly deeply, and Augustine was one of those, and Benedict is another one who this is giving us mature reflections about how to live a Christian life, a very specialized Christian life, the way of the monks, setting themselves up for their lifetime, living a very certain way. But there is this sense of them getting something right that in some ways got missed through much of the church and in church history. And that is to be a follower of Jesus is to be a disciple. And it means to learn from him, and it means to have our lives changed in the way that we live. Brothers, the Holy Scriptures cries out to us, saying, whoever is self-promoting will be humbled, and whoever is humble will be promoted. When it says this, it shows us that all self-promotion is a kind of pride. The prophet shows that he avoids this when he says, Lord, my heart is not lifted up, nor are my eyes fixed on the heights. I have not mixed myself in great affairs, nor in things too wonderful for me. But what if my thoughts are not humble? What if I rise up in pride? Then you will refuse me like a mother does a weaned child. So, brothers, if we wish to arrive at the pinnacle of humility, and if we wish to attain speedily to the heavenly heights to which one climbs by humility in this present life, and you hear in this, that this is, this is the beginning of the 7th chapter, and he is sitting here and he's explaining the goal, and why this is so important is because of this conviction that humility, out of all the Christian virtues, helps us ascend up towards God, helps us to become close to God. If one climbs by humility in this present life, then by our ascending acts we must set up that ladder which appeared to Jacob in a dream. It showed him angels descending and ascending. Doubtless we should understand this descent and ascent as follows. One descends by pride, and one ascends by humility. The towering ladders of course are earthly life, and when the heart is humble, God raises it up to heaven. We could say that our body and soul are the sides of the ladder into which the divine summons has inserted various rungs of humility and discipline for the ascent. And so what you have here is this picture about what our life can be. The way up towards heaven is through humility. The way down towards earth is through pride. You get a flavor here of some of the differences as far as when you go back and you read something like Benedict about how they interpreted Scripture versus how we do it today. That would not have been the main way that we would read the story of Jacob at Peniel, and him having this dream and seeing angels ascend and descend as he's on the run and he's headed towards Laban, his uncle. But we hear this, and there is some truth here as far as this, and it's a picture of saying, here's what's going on. We think humility will bring us closer to God. We think pride moves us away from God. We'd all be in agreement on that. And then our life, what we do with our bodies and what we do with our souls, our whole living life. And the rungs of the ladder are steps to take, our habits, our ways of living. And what we see here is a picture of a Christian understanding that if there are certain holy habits, certain disciplines that will help us climb up closer to God. Now, you're going to find this tension, and he'll lean into it as well of, is it grace or is it works? What do we do? And there's tension. It's going to be of grace, but our participation, our effort will help us ascend more speedily. And what we want is to be closer to God, because being closer with God is what life is really about. Now, according to Benedict, the way up is down. The goal is life with God, and the ladder is the way that we conduct our life. And it's the way that we conduct our earthly life that aims us towards heaven. The rungs are choices and disciplines that humble and orient us towards the grace of God. Humility is always lowering oneself before God and therefore others as well. Now, one of the things to note when we get into the monastic tradition is that it started with the hermits in the desert, and they focused on their individual pursuit about how to become humble and how to get close to God, how to flee the world and the influence of the world and become more holy and pure. And one of the things that happened with this is that shunning society and walking away from the privileges that go along with being somebody of significance in society, which some of these people did. The idea in monasticism of humility really begins to take on that flavor of thinking less of yourself, and it was strongly developed. It seems to be this, just so you know, one of the areas that I said is probably open to further research would be just kind of looking at the significance and influence of early monasticism and its defining of humility towards the self as thinking less of yourself, of lowering yourself. And so there's a loss there, I would argue, between the New Testament idea of tapaphrosyne, which is about not so much focusing on yourself, but not thinking about your own privileges and power for your own advantage, but purposely setting those things aside and in fact using those things for others to help lift them up. That's, again, my working definition of humility. But in monasticism, you're seeing this shift, and you can hear it here in Benedict. In describing the ladder of humility, Benedict was building upon Cassian, who identified 10 indicators of the presence of humility, and also a book called The Rule of the Master. And this is one of the things just to know is, we're focusing on a couple of people, Augustine, Benedict, Bernard, but all of them were building upon those who went before. And this is the part where, this should be some of the value that we have as Christians, of saying we have a heritage and a tradition. There's the old dictum that, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And this is the part where we don't know our tradition and we may have lost a whole bunch of things that went before. So going back and culling, Benedict had some fresh ideas. He said some things very well. But Benedict was not a lone genius who just came up with this on his own. There were people who he was listening to. And he's standing on their shoulders. And two of them are Cassian and the Rule of the Master. And it was from the Rule of the Master that he got the idea of the rungs of a ladder. Falscher, who writes on this period, she says, the image of a ladder is problematic for a number of perspectives. The coherence of Benedict's use of the metaphor of the ladder, the danger the ladder implies a program for achievement of humility, the risk of minimizing the length of the journey, and its tendency to emphasize the individual over the community. Now, some of the concerns that she raises, and I think they're real concerns, this is the part where when we go back and we read something like this and we don't have a specialist who's committed some of their time, there's probably going to be a sense that we're missing a little something. It's kind of the same thing where we can go and we can read the Bible, and we'll get a good idea of its overall message. But then we start to learn that we can listen to those who've committed their lives to being students of Scripture, and they write things called commentaries, and they give us a little history and background. And suddenly you realize, there was more going on to this story than I realized. Just like what we did by looking at the call that Jesus had, those who become like little children. And we have our assumptions about children today, and we realize that in the ancient world, their understanding of children were just much different. Well, we come into this, And it's easy to say that, we tend to be a quick fix society. We want things to be done rapidly. We want an easy process. We want 12 simple steps. And this is the part where we hear something like this chapter 7, and we hear, oh, here are the 10 rungs of the ladder. And we may just think that this is going to be a simple step. If I do step 1, I do step 2. And how long should I expect to do all of this? Is it going to be something like, 3 weeks, a month, 3 months? I mean, not a whole year, right? I mean, a whole year, you've got to be kidding. Now, you come in and you read, and you're coming out of our culture, and you're hearing these things. Oh, 12 simple steps. That sounds familiar. How long? I don't know. Probably pretty quick. That's not where monasticism was coming from. And so Fulcher's warning to us that we would hear this and we would move towards the individual, where back in that day they always started with the community, where we would move towards the quick fix. And the working assumption for monks was that this work of being conformed to the character and likeness of Christ, it was a life's work. Think 50 years. And you wouldn't complete it and you wouldn't perfect it, but this is the direction that you're headed. This is what you're going to do. And so, for me, it was one of those things where, beginning to sit there and think about, okay, so how do we help one another cultivate humility? I mean, that's part of what my doctoral dissertation was about. And there's a certain part where, I do believe that I think it begins with this sense of saying, okay, I think it should be part of the goal of conformity to Christ-likeness. I think that there are some habits, some disciplines, some things that I could do in my life that would probably really nurture and help me, and my working definition, be more quick to set aside my own privilege and benefit for myself and take my power, my resources, my influence, and use it for others. If I did some certain things, and we talked about that a number of weeks ago, as for example, not worrying about being humble, taking the discipline of washing dishes for 6 months for the family, every day, cleaning the kitchen. It's just sitting there and saying, today I'm serving. This is what I'm going to do, and you do those sorts of things, and it just begins to work in you. But at the same time, there's also this tempering of that where you say, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. This is a life's work. This is something I'll be pursuing for the rest of my life. Seems to be a more realistic goal, which is also that part where it's like, stop worrying about how people think about you and thinking of you as humble, and don't even focus on trying to, be known as being humble. Realize that humility will help you grow closer to Christ, will help you be a better leader, will help you be more Christ-like, and it's going to become just part of that pursuit of following Christ for the rest of your life. In the midst of really trying to allow the Holy Spirit to lead, and that's that tension part between the grace, what God does, and then our effort and what we bring to the table. Benedict, having lived many years as a hermit, ultimately embraced the Cenobitic form of monasticism. He finally left the desert by himself, and he decided that he wanted to try to do all of this in community. And the one thing about the hermetic, the individual hermit, is that it really did emphasize the individual over the community. And what part of the genius of Benedict is that he took this passion, this pursuit for holiness for God, of separating ourselves out from the world so that we're not like the world, but then said, the best way to do this is not by yourself, but it's in community. And I think that's the part where what you'll find is that Cenobitic monasticism brings us back into the social aspect, brings us back into really, how do we become more loving? Well, it's going to be by being in community with people. It's not going to be easy. It's easy to love the idea of people when you're all by yourself, but you get into community and you have to deal with the daily ins and outs. Well, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where things start to get difficult. And this is where then in the Cenobitic monasticism, the pursuit of humility becomes closer to the New Testament ideal, because one of my arguments is that the focus of humility in the New Testament is always social. It's how you live together in community. It's done in the context as the heat's getting turned up from the outside world on the church. One of the things that's going to give you unity and hold you together is the way that you live together. And central to the way that we live together is the humility in how we interact with one another, not considering ourselves better than others, but actually considering ourselves to be servants of others. That's going to go a long way of keeping unity within the community and forming Christ in us. Now, Benedict, placing humility in a communal context, emphasized both the lowering of oneself, which can have that negative idea of just thinking less of yourself, but at the very same time, he also emphasized it being a coordinating virtue of love. Humility helps you live in community and love the way that Christ loves us. The permanent presence of others tests what is happening interiorly and simultaneously offers opportunities for reshaping the self. As can be seen in Benedict's 12 rungs, he had 12. Except for the first rung, which orients us towards God, the remaining 11 have to do with how we live, love, and are humbled through community. And so, this central pursuit of the spirituality of monasticism palled a lot. It ends up looking at and saying, okay, the pursuit of humility is in 12 rungs. The first rung, love for God, putting him first, seems obvious. But the next 11 all have to do with now, how do we now, in light of our love for God, live out that love to one another in community, and how do we pursue humility in the midst of it? I'll give you a brief summary. This is, you could, of what the 12 rungs are. This is kind of an overview so you get an idea of it. It would need greater explanation if you want full understanding. There's going to be a little bit here where if you have no understanding of monasticism, some of these things are probably going to sound a little bit harsh, concerning. They're open to abuse, but if you find yourself in a community centered on Christ and love, then all of these things get tempered by those realities. But here they are. Keep the fear of God always before one's eyes. And that's the focus on God. Number 2, do not delight in satisfying our desires out of love for our own way. 3, submit to the superior in all obedience for love of God. 4, when obedience involves harsh, hostile things or even injustice of some sort, embrace them patiently with no outcry. And here you can hear a little bit of that concern, but this is the part where we're not always going to get things right in community. And so instead of always just demanding your justice, you're going to sit there and just, okay, I trust this, so I don't always have to get my way. I'm going to trust in you. Behind this all is that, those who humble themselves before the Lord will lift up. Again, could be abused, but at the very same time, sometimes you just going along and saying, you know what, I live in community, and it doesn't always have to be the way that I want. I'm here to serve. This is what they tried to do. 5, through humble confession to one's abbot, all evil thoughts that enter the heart, as well as the evil secretly committed. And the principle there is transparency and being honest and having some people, or at least one person in your life, who knows the truth about you. Be content with low and dishonorable treatment. Turn the other cheek. 7, not only confessing with one's tongue, but believing in one's heart that one is lower and less honorable than all of the rest. I'd give a little bit of a critique in that direction. Again, I think it's a little sub-biblical, but you get the idea of what they were doing. Do nothing except what is encouraged by the common rule of the monastery. Hold back one's tongue from speaking, and out of love for silence, do not speak unless asked a question. Do not be quick to laugh at the slightest provocation. You'll find this in monasticism, that basically laughter was kind of looked down upon. And again, this is the part where there's always places to critique the way that we end up manifesting, pursuing Christ together. We're a little broken, we're a little fallen, we're really broken, we're really fallen. It's different degrees, different centuries, different perspectives. Here's a part where I think they're missing out a little bit on understanding who Jesus is. But there's a biblical part of this, because a lot of the idea of laughing that you see in the Bible is actually looked down upon. Because a lot of that laughing is the sort of scoffing, or it's a sort of jesting and joking that in its nature is not good, but ultimately is something that hurts others. So you get that here. 11, when one speaks at all, do so gently and without laughter, not with shouting. 12, one's humility is not only in his heart, but is apparent in one's body. It's not just how you think about yourself, but it's actually what you do with your body. It's demonstrated in action and in service. Having chosen to live in community, Benedict and those who followed had to work out how to live together as neighbors. Power, status, honor, privilege, all these issues come together in community. And as can be seen in Benedict's ladder, power and obedience to the abbot are central concerns. Fowler maintains that these issues are present because of the deeper concern of honor and its counterparts, dishonor, shame, and even humiliation. Humility here has a social context and social implications. This is the part where it's hard to live close in community with others. It's also really, really good, but you got to be intentional, or there will be a lot of hurt and dysfunction. And so this rule book is a sign of that intentionality about how do we live together well. And we need some boundaries. We need to be in agreement about what love looks like. And so it helped them. And behind it all was this pursuit of humility, with this idea that I'm not going to pursue becoming selfish and having it all about me. Instead, I want to be other-focused. If you sum up Benedict, there's a couple of things. Humility is always a lowering of oneself. That always comes through. And I think it's a little bit of missing the mark. It's not the goal, but it is a means. I think that's getting us closer to the biblical idea. Indeed, the central way of achieving blessed communion with God, that's the goal, both now and more importantly in the life to come. Benedict affirms that humility comes by grace. God raises the ladder, but we work out our salvation by taking steps of humble obedience to Jesus Christ, laid out in the rule book. The rungs of the ladder are not a simple program, but another writer on monasticism, Michael Casey, writes, the ladder of humility gives us a sequential account of the way in which humility manifests itself over 40 or 50 years of monastic living. So when you read the rule book, realize that this is something that they understood would get worked out over time, decades, as you were pursuing conformity to Christ. Perhaps most importantly, Benedict reminds us that these steps are worked out in community. It is with and through community that we grow in humility. And I would put forward, I think that if we really want to pursue humility, it's going to mean turning towards cultivating authentic Christian community. It means that we're going to need to learn how to share life together. And it means that your life group, or whatever sort of smaller group that you end up participating with, will be this place that becomes more transparent, becomes a place where people really know you, where you share life, where there is that place where you're all committed. We want to grow up into Christ together. We're going to call the best out of one another. We're going to sometimes even be willing to challenge and confront one another. And we want to create a place where this can be something where we can share not only our dreams and our passions, but we can say, and I want you to help me get there by you holding me accountable to some of the commitments that I'm going to make so that I can live the way of Christ. That's the picture of monasticism, and I believe that sort of community experience is going to be one of the very best things that helps us cultivate that sort of humility. This last year, I read the stories of a few pastors of larger churches that have fallen. And, and one of the things that you see there is that there's a common pattern that the higher you climb, the less people in your life are willing to really speak truth to you. You may not have as many people that are part of that trusted inner circle. You may stop listening to some of those people. Whatever reason, though, there does seem to be that pattern that as you go up, there are a few people, and over time, you stop being Ralph or Sean or Ken or whoever, but then you're this person up here, and and it takes intentionality where instead of being this person up here, you're this person face to face, and you go, I need people to speak truth in my life. So that is Benedict of Nursia. Now let me tell you about Bernard of Clairvaux. In 1115, at the age of 25, Bernard of Fontaines was elected the abbot of the newly formed monastery of Clairvaux, and he was a little bit young. It was a surprise, but some of it was because of his genius, because of how he already had done in school and the promise that he showed. While he would remain its abbot for the rest of his life, Bernard became a leader on the world stage. This is one of the values of looking at Bernard. He wrote on humility. He was a monk. He helped form a new order, the Cistercians. But not only did he exercise a limited role of leadership as the head of a monastery, but he experienced leadership on the world stage. He launched 70 monasteries. He established 100 affiliations. He combated heresy. He was even instrumental in launching one of the crusades. This one was one of the dubious ones. Under his direction, during his lifetime, the Cistercian movement elevated 29 bishops, 7 cardinals, and 1 pope. And the 1 pope, Bernard was one of his most trusted advisors. For all of this, he is most famous today for his writings, both mystical and practical. Yet Bernard's early elevation to leadership reads like a story from Warren Bennis. He was one of our leadership experts, and he said leaders aren't so much born, but they're made. His first years were rocky, to say the least. Bernard was placed under the obedience of a local bishop, and he was forced to live in a small hut outside the monastery. One would probably surmise, writes Faucher, that Bernard had experienced a nervous breakdown in these early years. Bernard's beginning of leadership was marked more by failure than triumph. It would have a lasting impact on his understanding of both humility and leadership. Bernard is a complex figure, a large body of writing, and even more complex history behind it. Wading into his works as an attempt to understand his perspective on humility can be daunting. Part of it is his very first published work, when he was just a newly formed abbot, is The Steps of Humility and Pride. And this was his treatment of humility, except later on he wrote more about it, but never in this full way, more than developed in different sermons as well as correspondence. And because we have so much stuff, and then we're dealing with humility in the book that's really his early thought, if you really want to wade into Bernard, you need not only focus on that one book, but you have to go some other places as well. And I've done some of that work, and we'll share a little bit of the insights of that with you. Now, the steps of humility and pride signaled his basic direction or orientation, which doesn't significantly change, but over time his theology and even his explanation of humility does become more nuanced. Of particular importance for understanding humility and leadership, one needs to consult his work on the conduct and office of bishops. And then you might want to consult people like Michael Casey, John Leclerc, and Jane Faucher, who provide background as far as secondary sources that specialize in all of his writings and can kind of synthesize the material and help explain it. But let me just say that I was actually pleasantly surprised. I read The Steps of Humility, and it was edifying. It was beautiful. And then I dove into some of the deeper understanding, and looked at some of the secondary material, and I went, wow, there's a richness here. For Bernard, humility is Jesus. He is the example of humility, he is the means of humility, and he is the goal of humility. The reason that you pursue humility, what humility is all about, is really you just want Jesus. And this is the part, where one of the things I guess I just want to encourage is that we can lay over all of these trappings of the Christian faith. But in the end, it's just a love story. It's just a relationship. It's primarily about us and God. And I say us intentionally because individualistically in America we tend with me, and we can fall into the me and Jesus. And sometimes the clearest way that I see Jesus is not by looking in the mirror, but seeing Jesus in others. But then behind all of the ways that I see Jesus in others is Jesus himself. And he's formed us into a community to be with him. This is how Bernard opens with his book, The Steps of Humility and Pride. Before I speak of the different steps of humility, which indeed St. Benedict does, not ask us to count but to climb, I will first try to show what we may expect to find at the top. The toil will be easier if we have the prophet before our eyes. And prophet there is not like a prophet who's predicting the future, but the prophet of actually what we earn. This is what all the work is about. This is the goal. This is what we're headed for. Our Lord shows us plainly both the difficulty and reward of the work. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way is humility. The goal is truth. The first is the labor. The second is the reward. But you may ask, how do I know that he is speaking of humility? He only uses the general word, I am the way. Well, I will give you a clear test. Learn of me, for I am meek and humble of heart. He points to himself as an example of humility, a model of meekness. Imitate him, and you will not walk in darkness, but you will have the light of life. What is the light of life but truth that enlightens every man that comes into the world and shows where the true life is to be found? So when he says, I am the way and the truth, he adds, and the life. It is as if he said, I am the way, I lead to truth, I am the truth, I promise life, and I myself am the very life that I give you. And what he's saying and what he's focusing on and what he's about is this is all about you with Jesus. It's about him. The way, the truth, the life, the means. Bernard's approach is encouraging, optimistic, and yet at the very same time realistic. He stands in the stream of monasticism that understands that humility is a life's work, a climb both long and arduous. The way of humility also includes humiliation, as Bernard himself had experienced. It is slow because it's always an interplay of God's grace and our corrupted nature, a battle between the renewed spirit that is willing and the fallen nature that is weak. Bernard wants to lighten the load because Jesus wants to lighten the load. Bernard advises, can you hear him calling from his lofty station and crying to those who seek him? For he knows who are his own. Come to me, all who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. Come to me, all you who labor, and I will refresh. He says, come. Where? To me, the truth. How? By humility. The way of humility is hard but good. And so Bernard wants us to see the goodness. And it's one of the things, that I think from Bernard, we've got to encourage and just realize we can be so hard on ourselves. We can be so focused on the work, on how difficult, on how lowly. We can get caught up in thinking less of ourselves, which seems to be so much the definition. And we lose that this is really about Jesus and his love and his passion, his commitment and his desire and what he wants for us. And it should bring joy and a smile to our face, and it should lighten the load, and it should make us feel good. Humility is not this incredible pressure that we put upon ourselves. Humility is the way of Jesus. And the way of Jesus is life, is wonderful, is good. Not easy, but it's good. The first major section of his treatise lays out a theology of humility in two parts. First, he sets the goal, which we just heard, and then he explains how the steps will lead to the promised reward. The second part of his treatise on the steps of humility and pride is an interesting twist on Benedict. Benedict mapped out 12 steps that align our lives with humility and helps us ascend to God. Bernard admits that he's more familiar with the way down. He knows of pride, not so much of humility. And he knows how this pride leads us away from God. And so he determines, if I focus on pride, and then we do the opposite of pride, will that not help us step up over pride into humility? And that becomes his 12 steps, is that he ends up looking at the steps of pride and says, okay, if we want to go humility, we go the reverse. Now, for Bernard, the goodness of humility is that brings us into truth, which he describes as the goal. For Faucher, according to Faucher, the idea of walking either towards or away of truth is central to Bernard and his thinking about humility as well as pride. It forms part of his primary contribution. So one of the things is that, instead of, am I humble, it's what direction am I headed? Am I headed towards Christ or am I headed away from Christ? Am I headed towards the truth or am I walking away from the truth? Am I stepping into humility or am I stepping into pride? It's more about direction than it is about destination. And I think that is a significant thing to keep focused when we realize the battle of humility is not a quick fix, 12 steps that are done in 3 months, but it is a life's work. Now, in reading Bernard, he is both deeply biblical and Trinitarian in his thinking. Progressing in the way of humility will lead to 3 steps or degrees of truth. It will lead first, step 1, to a greater truth about ourselves. Step 2, truth about our neighbors. And then the highest truth, step 3, is truth about the triune God. According to Bernard, the fundamental truth about ourselves is to know that we are less than we should be. This step affirms the view of Augustine, and he actually quotes Augustine. Humility is a virtue by which a man of low opinion of himself, humility is a virtue by which a man has a low opinion of himself because he knows himself well. It's somebody who comes to the place where they realize I'm broken and I can't fix myself. And for Augustine and for Bernard, that is a first step into humility. Now, if humility is only seen through the lens of Augustine's definition, there is a danger of settling for a primarily negative view. That is, humility is essentially self-loathing. Oh, what a wretched man that I am. That is not Bernard's intention. We need to read Bernard in light of his very optimistic anthropology. Bernard believed that we were image bearers. he believed that Christ came to redeem us and that we're going to live in glory. He knows our brokenness, and that's the problem, but he focuses on our salvation and who Jesus is and how he gets us there. And just so you know, that balance, and I think I'll end with this. So I've been making a strong argument throughout all of this that when we think about the idea of humility, that we primarily don't define it as thinking less of yourself. I think that's, it's part of the most popular way that people think about humility. But it's not the biblical idea of humility. The biblical idea of humility is this one where you don't consider your privilege and status something to be used to your own advantage. But instead, you marshal your power, your resources, your influence for service to others. And going along with what we'd said from Dixon, it always involves a choice. And it is a choice that presumes a place of significance of power. You have something to give others. And so you don't begin with this, lowly self. You begin with who you are. You are beloved. You're an image bearer. I think that's the beginning point of humility. Now, part of the reality is that we're broken. Part of the reality is that I am a miserable sinner. Jesus had to die for me. But the gospel deals with sin because there's the work of Jesus Christ. There is good news, and the good news overcomes the bad news, and the bad news is always secondary, because this is not who you were made to be. You were made for glory. Now, if you humble yourself before God, if you come to the truth, if you admit that you've been trying to live life without God on your own, then he will raise you up. And he will give you a name, just like he's given Jesus a name. And he will lift you up into glory. And so when we live into this tension, we never deny the negative stuff. But that's not our focus. It's not the primary concern. And whenever the gospel's primary focus seems to be on the miserable sinner, I think we're missing the major part of what the gospel is about. It's about Jesus, salvation, good news, who Jesus says that I am, what he has done for me. And there is this part about saying, here are some of the choices that I made that has led to my ruin. And I am a miserable sinner, and I need a Savior because I can't save myself. But that's not the whole story about me. It's my past, but it's not my future. And with Bernard, you have this very positive sense of understanding that's the way that we're supposed to deal with this tension. So the first step, and ultimately, and we'll talk about this next week, is he'll call this the cool side of humility. We all of us need to come to this place to be humbled to the point where we realize that I'm a sinner in need of a Savior. And to come to that true sense of self, which is the first step into humility and truth. I'm not all that. I can't save myself. I really do need God. But it's only the first step. It's not even the most important step, but it is the beginning step. And so with that, we will come back next week and we will hear not only finish up the cool side of humility, but we will get to the more important warm side of humility, and then what this all leads to, which is us coming closer to God. And then we're going to deal with modern treatments, and then we'll deal a little bit more, and we'll almost be done with this section, but it'll probably take us a couple weeks. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful night and a great week. God bless, and take care.